Truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Monday, October 28th, 2024, the 1,377th day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening through a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can become a paid subscriber for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month. And in doing so, you will get the ad-free experience. You'll be able to participate in the conversation over on Substack, and you'll be invited to the interactive live stream every Wednesday afternoon. And if you can't, or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the free version on Substack, a wide variety of podcast platforms, and of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site in the show notes or by visiting linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. Anyone who understands the roller coaster we've been on these past few years knows we haven't reached the end yet, and there may still be hard times to come. And as we add $1 trillion to the national debt every 100 days, we could be headed for some shaky financial times. If you're like me, you're figuring out how to diversify and make sure some seeds are planted for whatever may come. And that's one of the many reasons I think Bitcoin is part of our future. But it's not only about money. Bitcoin looks to be a critical part of the next generation of technology, communications, energy, verification, and even national defense. I'd encourage everyone to do their research and do it now. And if you're convinced of the likelihood that Bitcoin is an essential part of our future, then you'll need an on-ramp. I recommend River. River empowers you to grow your portfolio without any unwanted surprises and eliminates third-party custodians, putting you in control of your assets. Open an account with no minimum purchase requirement. You can get your Bitcoin journey started with just $1. Visit partner.river.com/reasonable to create your River account today. That's partner.river.com/reasonable. Now, I know that many of you out there understand the need to diversify assets, or maybe you're looking to protect your retirement savings, but you're not quite there yet on Bitcoin, and you feel better about precious metals. I get that too. I think going in multiple directions is wise, and I do that myself. And when it comes to buying precious metals, you want to be working with a good company, and that's why I've partnered with Goldco. Goldco is a 6-time Inc. 5000 winner, 2022 Company of the Year, and they've helped people like you and me place over $2 billion in gold and silver. And I have gotten silver from Goldco. And right now they're offering my supporters up to $10,000 in bonus silver while supplies last. Don't pass this offer up. Go to reasonablegold.com now. This is your opportunity to protect you and your family from an out-of-control government before it's too late. So don't wait a second longer. Take action today. Click on the link in the podcast notes or go to reasonablegold.com now and get your free gold kit, your free IRA kit. You'll be glad you did. All right, so on Friday, we discussed the BRICS summit last week in Kazan, Russia. So let's pick it up right there. This is from this morning on CNBC.
Yeah, it's a non-U.S. asset. It's an emerging markets asset. And while we were all hyperventilating about the election over the last week, BRICS had a conference in Russia. There's 6 new members of BRICS this year. So BRICS GDP is now greater than the combined GDP of G7. Of the 6 new members, 3 of them, Argentina, the UAE, and Ethiopia, are now mining Bitcoin with government resources. So there is tremendous urgency outside of the U.S. to find a way to circumvent the irresponsible fiscal policy that we've been running here in the U.S. In fact, Russia announced an initiative. Their sovereign wealth fund is going to invest in a regional initiative to build Bitcoin mining and AI infrastructure throughout BRICS with an idea of settling global trade in Bitcoin. So look, someday, I don't know if it's 5 years, 10 years, Putin's going to die. We're going to look to reintegrate some of these countries into the world financial system, and they're going to be trading with Bitcoin. What are we going to be doing?
Now, that's not me saying that. That's probably not a Bitcoin maxi saying that or a MAGA guy. That's a totally mainstream guest on CNBC. And what he just said is that countries around the world are looking for an alternative to the global regime's fiat banking system. And they are looking to BRICS and they are looking to Bitcoin because Russia is going to take part of its sovereign wealth fund and invest in Bitcoin spread amongst the BRICS nations. Is that a trick? Are they fooling everybody into Bitcoin? That's basically the argument at this point. If you want to abstain and you don't want to attempt to learn about what it is. Now, I might be wrong. We all might be wrong about a lot of things. And there's a lot of evil out there. We could all be tricked. We could be dog walked into the Great Reset right now. And if that's the case, then we're going to have to prepare for a much tougher fight on a much longer timeline. And if that's what it is, so be it. We will look back on some of our past judgments and try to figure out where it all went wrong. People then have a tendency to assume that if you don't preference that viewpoint, that the global regime still has all the command and the people are being walked into their own doom, then somehow you're ignoring the possibility. That's not really what it's about. I don't ignore these possibilities. I understand I might be wrong. I understand I have biases, but I try to account for them. And I try to account for them by making the opposite case of what I think in as serious a way as I support what I think. I try to pick my own beliefs apart and try to consider what the opposite of that belief would be like. And then I try to think about whether or not that point of view maps onto the reality as I see it better than the belief I hold. And I don't find those views convincing. I don't believe the global regime is in control. I don't believe that their agenda is working. And I don't believe that Donald Trump is a Judas goat leading us all to the slaughter. Now, I could be wrong about all of these things, but one thing I'm absolutely certain about is that over the last 9 years, what Donald Trump has done has woken up tens, if not hundreds of millions of people and potentially billions of people worldwide whose culture and information is downstream from American culture and information. Now, if it turned out that he was evil despite all that, I would still simply accept that and move forward because the awakening he's caused is bigger and more meaningful than however much closer to our doom he may have led us. He would be building the weapons that would then be used against him on the assumption that the cult-like loyalty would protect him. But there's not a cult-like loyalty. People love Donald Trump because of the awakening that he's caused and because he is serving the best interests of Americans. But the awakening process isn't stopping. It'll keep moving forward. People think the same of Elon and worry about the future of the technocracy and whether the purpose of Elon Musk is to make it look smart and cool, to once again be willing participants in our own destruction. Neuralink is creepy. AI is creepy. A parallel information structure seen to be run by one man is creepy, though it's not creepier than what we have right now. The technology is going to exist. It's going to be part of our world. Should we deny that it exists? These are important questions. We have the worst, most evil financial system known to mankind right now, or at least we have had it for a long time. Is Bitcoin their new currency? A lot of people worry Bitcoin's going to be the new central bank digital currency. Now, I'd suggest that most of the people who think that probably don't know much about Bitcoin, but I don't know everything. It would be crazy not to allow for some small chance that that's correct and we've all been tricked. One would then wonder why they're not doing a better job of advertising the transition to Bitcoin as a smart idea, but maybe there's a reason. Maybe they want people walking faithfully and proudly into their new system. It's not hard to create catastrophic scenarios about the thing that you have or the thing that might emerge in the world that has all the signs of the thing you wanted, all the qualities, the characteristics of the thing you had been asking for and demanding from the world. But you have a hard time accepting that's what you've been given, and so you reject it because you don't think there's a chance that that kind of good could come from a world like this, or maybe that it just sounds too easy. And again, maybe you're right. But I think the divide here is more just a question of optimism or pessimism. Are you hopeful for a better future? Are you faithful that one might emerge, or at least that you will keep going come what may? I certainly can't promise I'm going to give anybody the right answers, but I will take the time to go through my entire decision-making process, what I see to be all of the relevant aspects of an individual decision, an analysis, an issue, and think about what conclusions can be drawn that head in a direction of truth and moral goodness. If we're wrong after that, we just learn from our mistakes and start over again. But whatever path it is we choose, I think we can still be hopeful as we walk that path. If we find out we went the wrong direction, we turn around, we go all the way back and try not to make a mistake like that again. But it seems crazy to me to not bother learning about something that will absolutely be a major part of the world to come, based on the notion that it necessarily has to be bad, because ultimately all things will be bad. I understand it's a fallen world, but we all still live here. And it's funny because the choice ultimately is just trying something new when we know the thing we've been doing is evil and makes us feel terrible about ourselves. It sounds like BRICS is in on Bitcoin. And of course, Donald Trump is in on Bitcoin. And RFK Jr. is in on Bitcoin, and it seems like Elon Musk is probably in on Bitcoin, but he doesn't really say it. Tesla, however, is working on energy capture, storage, and transmission in a decentralized fashion, on information transmission in a decentralized fashion, cybersecurity, transportation, and potentially at least the end of censorship if information transmission truly becomes decentralized. Most of those are examples of things that are not only important for Bitcoin, but necessary for Bitcoin. He's also the largest recipient of Department of Defense contracts, which fits neatly into Space Force Major Jason Lowry's MIT thesis, Soft War. Now, for years, people have questioned whether or not Bitcoin would be valuable. Would it still be around? Backing by Russia and BRICS would guarantee that it is around. It would be silly to assume that Bitcoin was created to attack the American people or America the country. It would be to attack the global regime fiat bankers whose currency is branded as the American dollar. The BRICS countries know that, and Donald Trump has great relationships with those BRICS leaders. So eventually you end up at the point where you have to either say the whole thing is evil or stop picking and choosing the individual parts that you believe are evil, because if those parts are spoiled, it's probably the whole thing. But let's get back into the conference. One of the other major things to emerge from that conference is the Kazan Declaration. This is a Twitter thread that breaks it down. This is from Sputnik International. So this is Russian state media. Be very afraid. It's not that good regime state media like the BBC and the New York Times. This is Russian state media, so it's dangerous. What's inside the BRICS Summit's Kazan Declaration? BRICS has adopted the final declaration of its summit in Kazan, Russia, with plans to submit the document to the UN. Here's what's inside. The need for reform of global institutions. The Bretton Woods international financial systems institutions, including the World Trade Organization, should be reformed to better represent developing countries' interests. BRICS opposes, quote, unilateral, prohibitive, discriminatory, and protectionist, end quote, measures taken under the pretext of fighting global climate change, including carbon emissions adjustment mechanisms and taxes. BRICS supports comprehensive reform of the United Nations, including the Security Council, to make it more representative and notes its centrality in the system of relations between the nations. So they're declaring they're out on the Bretton Woods system, they're out on climate change, and they're prepared to neuter the UN, if not make it obsolete. It doesn't sound like they're our enemies, but maybe we're all getting tricked. New initiatives. BRICS members recognize the potential of information and communication technologies in bridging the digital divide between nations to aid socioeconomic development. BRICS intends to transform the new development bank to serve the needs of the 21st century. BRICS supports the creation of a new technology platform to strengthen development cooperation, including by creating high-tech products using domestic technological potential to fuel, quote, sustainable and inclusive growth. The organization agrees to explore the creation of an independent cross-border settlement and depository infrastructure known as BRICS Clear, so that would replace the SWIFT system of the regime. BRICS is ready to strengthen cooperation to develop medicines, including vaccines and nuclear medicine projects. BRICS welcomes the creation of a united transport and logistics platform. That seems a little weird. Sustainable and inclusive sounds a little weird. Vaccines and nuclear medicine sound a little weird. But is the fact that those things sound weird enough to make us now ignore BRICS? You know what? I don't need to follow anything BRICS does anymore because they support vaccines. And I know sustainable and inclusive are code words, and I don't like them, even though they already said they were out on climate change. And speaking of climate change, the globalist organization Oxfam reported that somewhere between $24 and $41 billion worth of global climate change money has been lost, and that it could actually be twice that, or maybe even 10 times that. And considering it's a globalist organization putting this news out there, you can kind of assume that maybe it's 100 times that. The declaration supports Russia's proposal to create a grain exchange to, quote, promote rules-based trade in agricultural products and fertilizers and minimize disruptions, end quote. Here are the bullet points under the heading Expanding Cooperation. The declaration welcomes the expanded use of national currencies for transactions between BRICS members and their trade partners. The document highlights the importance of expanding cooperation based on common interests and further building up strategic partnerships among BRICS members and continuing to implement the bloc's economic partnership strategy. The bloc welcomes interest shown by countries of the global south toward BRICS and calls for greater participation of the least developed nations, especially in Africa, in global processes. Now, outside of the argument for total isolationism, I don't think there's anything objectionable there. Opposing global crises. The document condemns the illegal use of discriminatory and politically motivated sanctions and highlights their negative impact on the world economy. Good. BRICS is opposed to the deployment of weapons in outer space and supports strengthening the global non-proliferation and disarmament regimes and implementing a Security Council resolution on measures to prevent WMDs from falling into the hands of terrorists. It calls for strengthened ties between law enforcement to aid in the fight against narcotics. And you might remember a couple of weeks ago, Donald Trump told a comedian he did a podcast with that he was close to total nuclear disarmament when he was in office. Like ending the Ukraine conflict and the Israel conflict, it would take a day. He would simply say, it's over now. And it would be. How is that possible? Think on that and we will continue. Bloc members outlined their positions on the Ukraine crisis and took note of proposals for mediation to bring the conflict to a conclusion through negotiations. BRICS expressed support for Palestine's full-fledged membership in the UN. That's crazy, huh? The countries that represent over half the world's economy and half the world's population believe that Palestine is already its own state? It's like they don't care about the maps the globalists drew at all. The declaration condemns Israel's attack on UN employees in Lebanon and the pager terror attack of September 17th. Oh, we were told those were terrorists that the Israelis blew up. BRICS welcomes the creation of a Haitian Transitional Presidential Council and Electoral Council to resolve the crisis plaguing the Caribbean nation. Oh, isn't Haiti the place that Hillary Clinton destroyed? So BRICS isn't a friend of the Clintons? What? BRICS expresses concern over the escalating violence and worsening humanitarian situation in Sudan and called for a ceasefire. The declaration criticizes the politicization of human rights and double standards in this area. Who could they be talking about? This document expresses oppositions to all forms of discrimination in sports. And much like men and women's sports, that's a little ambiguous. Are they concerned about ending discrimination against transformers? Or is allowing men to play in women's sports discrimination against women? The same outlet, Sputnik International, published a column from the journalist Pepe Escobar, BRICS Make History. Can they keep the momentum? And just a couple of things from this article. Connectivity corridors. That is the main geoeconomic theme of Eurasia integration and Afro-Eurasia integration as well. Putin explicitly named more than once the new growth drivers of the near future, Southeast Asia and Africa. Both happen to be key partners of several high-profile Chinese Belt and Road Initiative projects. Additionally, Putin named the top two connectivity corridors of the future, the Northern Sea Route, which the Chinese describe as the Arctic Silk Road, and the International North-South Transportation Corridor, where the three drivers are BRICS members, Russia, Iran, and India. So that translates as BRICS China crisscrossing Eurasia from east to west, while BRICS Russia, Iran, India crisscross it from north to south, with ramifications in all latitudes. And with all the energy add-ons, with Iran positioning itself as a crucial energy hub, opening the finally feasible possibility of building the Iran-Pakistan-India pipeline. The global regime has no role in this. These are the countries we are told to fear. If we are the global regime's proxies, then we have no role in this. Why should we fear this? Are these countries doing this to eventually destroy us? Well, maybe, but it doesn't really seem like it. The people who are angriest about this, the people pushing that viewpoint, are the people downstream from the global regime helping to sell and implement their agenda. That is the agenda we are explicitly rejecting. We don't need to assume that they are right about Russia and China. Well, they're evil, and they're always propagandizing us, and they're always censoring us, and they're poisoning us and our children, and they're trying to kill us, and they're trying to get us to kill our children, and they're trying to get us to morally degrade ourselves, and they're trying to impoverish us, and they're trying to get us to go to war. But they're probably right about the war part. Escobar writes, the return of the Primakov Triangle. There were immense expectations all across the global majority of a breakthrough in Kazan on alternate payment systems. Realist Russian-Chinese finance tech experts commented they, quote, did not see anything at all except for another round of initiatives about grain exchange, precious metals exchange, and investment platforms. BRICS Clear is being somehow developed, but the rest will not work without proper sovereign infrastructure, end quote. And that brings us back to the unit project, a form of apolitical money anchored in gold and BRICS plus currencies, which was exhaustively discussed by the working groups and reached the Russian Ministry of Finance. The next necessary step is a trial run by a major business conglomerate. That may happen soon, and if successful, will stimulate other major companies in BRICS nations to tag along. So they're talking about this being pinned to gold. I personally do not think that is likely. I think it will be pinned to Bitcoin, as we just heard on CNBC, but as we've been saying for a very long time. Now, in Escobar's logic, if it's Bitcoin and not gold, then it's already being tested out. BRICS countries are not building up their Bitcoin mining capacity so they can switch to a gold-backed currency. Bitcoin is harder money than gold is. Like most of what we're watching today, they are a lot farther along in this process. He writes, as for the BRICS digital investment platform, it is already a go. Alongside the NDB, The BRICS Bank and Putin encouraged former Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff to stay on at the helm. This will facilitate Global South access to financing without the dreaded IMF/World Bank structural adjustment conditionalities. The BRICS exchange, establishing clear, transparent rules, will be essential to secure Global South food security. The BRICS made it clear that the complex drive toward a new settlement and payment infrastructure is inevitable, but a long work in progress, especially when the G7, which for all practical purposes is hijacking the agenda for the G20 next month in Rio, wants to finance at least $20 billion of a $50 billion package to Ukraine with proceeds from stolen Russian assets. And that is a narrative that has been building for quite a long time as well. It's interesting that he talks about the G7 countries hijacking the narrative. That is what they do. That is why they build the layer of the false reality on top of reality prime. This is something I don't think I've discussed on the show before, but have thought about for a while. It's entirely possible that the UN agenda, the World Economic Forum agenda, all of that could be making the good things in reality prime look like the very things that are leading us toward our doom. That's why we really do have to weigh and measure both sides and be prepared to let things go. Sometimes good and evil masked as good are really hard to discern. But let's continue. And that brings us to the most glaring BRICS problems. Achieving consensus on difficult dossiers is extremely hard and may lead in the long run to BRICS moving toward an absolute majority mechanism to get things done. The Brazilian case vetoing Venezuela as a BRICS partner did not go down well at all among members, among partners, and across the Global South. The current Lula government may be under tremendous pressure by the hegemon's Democrat establishment, but that in itself does not explain the decision. And that, my friends, is all signal. Lula is Brazil's Biden, and Lula's veto is the one drop of food coloring into a clear glass of water that taints the whole thing. There is a massive anti-BRICS lobby inside the highest levels of the Brazilian government, facilitated as usual by American NGOs as well as the European Commission, heavily infiltrated among the proverbial comprador elites. Brasilia this year privileged the G20 over BRICS. That foresees trouble for next year when Brazil assumes the BRICS presidency. The prospects are not exactly brilliant. Now, all of this tracks with the understanding that we've been developing about geopolitics over the last few years, the good twin, evil twin dynamic, and the emergence of the multipolar world order. These are the sorts of things you would expect if you were trying to build an alliance of sovereign nations that wanted to remain sovereign while gathering their strength to oppose the global regime, hitting it where it hurts the worst, in the currency. Now, are the bankers whose currency is being destroyed doing all of this to themselves to walk us in to the central bank digital currency? Maybe. Their plans do call for that. That is what they say. But again, if that's the case, then the whole thing is rotten. And I do not assume that, though I am open to the possibility. We have to be cautious about all possibilities. It seems extraordinarily unlikely to me, but I've been wrong before, and I assume I will be wrong again. Let's shift gears. This is the New York Times on Friday. Mississippi's absentee ballot measure violates federal law, appeals court rules. A Mississippi law requiring officials to count absentee ballots received by mail up to 5 days after Election Day violates federal law. An appeals court ruled on Friday. It appeared unlikely that the ruling, which sent the issue back to a lower court, would affect this election, but experts said it could eventually undermine similar practices around the country. Now, that is what we're told, by and large. This is not going to affect this election. And by that, they mean this isn't going to change any of the election processes in place right now by the time next week rolls around. But if states go ahead and accept ballots after the fact and then add them into the count, they would have a big problem on their hands. Now, I have no doubt they're prepared to go ahead and do this and hope the lawfare just runs the clock out to the extent that we actually have to progress through this entire fake election narrative. Hopefully we won't. Hopefully stories like this and decisions like this will do the trick, but if we have to go through it, then we're going to see it all play out. Let's continue with the article. The Republican National Committee, the Mississippi Republican Party, and other plaintiffs had challenged the law, arguing that the state had effectively extended each election beyond the date set by federal law. The defendants, including Mississippi's Secretary of State, countered that although all votes must be cast by Election Day, states were free to take longer to receive and count the votes. In a written opinion, a 3-judge panel on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit disagreed, but stopped short of blocking the law. Congress statutorily designated a singular day for the election of members of Congress and the appointment of presidential electors, wrote Judge Andrew Oldham, a Trump appointee. Text, precedent, and historical practice confirm this day for the election is the day by which ballots must be both cast by voters and received by state officials. That is from the judge's decision. So one, in quotes, day for the election, not 7 weeks of voting and then 3 more weeks of counting, 1 day for the election. And of course, that was before they changed over the electoral processes in this country. Why did they do that? None of it's been legitimate the entire time. I assume this will go up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will decide that ballots cannot be counted if they come in after Election Day. And that's going to invalidate a whole lot of elections. The panel sent the case back to the district court, which had sided with the defendants to reconsider the case. But the appellate judges said the lower court should give, quote, due consideration to the value of preserving the status quo in a voting case on the eve of an election, end quote. The decision applies only to Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, which are under the Fifth Circuit's jurisdiction. But its logic, if applied around the country, would invalidate similar laws in about 20 states that count absentee ballots received after Election Day, including the battleground state of Nevada. Legal experts said the Supreme Court would be unlikely to review the case before November 5th and issue a ruling that would apply nationally because the court is generally reluctant to alter voting rules so close to an election. And the Mississippi Secretary of State said it had concluded the ruling would not take effect before Election Day. But the Mississippi case is almost certain to wind up before the High Court at some point, says an election law expert at NYU. Michael Whatley, chairman of the RNC, applauded Friday's ruling as a, quote, major win for election integrity. He went on, we will continue to defend the law, fight for protection of every legal vote, and stop election interference in our country's most important election. Liberal groups that had opposed the lawsuit said the Fifth Circuit's ruling could cast a shadow over the practice of counting absentee votes received after Election Day, sowing mistrust in a presidential contest that polls show is extremely close. Well, yes, some fake news polls do show a close election. People do believe it is a close election, but of course it's not even a real election, much less a close one. Also, polls have no bearing on constitutional law. Those running elections should be very concerned if they are counting votes past Election Day. Perhaps they are counting on that. Maybe there are people on that side who would love to see the quote-unquote election run again. But regardless, at some point in the near future, receiving and counting quote-unquote votes past Election Day will not be happening. Let's skip down toward the end. The political implications are unclear. There are indications that not counting absentee ballots that arrive after Election Day could actually hurt Republicans, said Michael McDonald, a political scientist at the University of Florida who studies voting. For example, people in rural areas are more likely to skew Republican and are more likely to be affected by mail delays that cause their absentee ballots to arrive late, Mr. McDonald said. Democrats who have mail ballots in hand, they're returning their mail ballots at a faster rate than the Republicans are right now, he said. Well, Michael McDonald, I guess we'll just have to take our chances. You have to understand that trick, though. The New York Times just tried to make it sound to any Republican who might read this that there's a good reason why they should want ballots to be received after Election Day. And they're convincing the child brains in their audience to once again believe that the Republicans are so concerned about election integrity that they're actually just hurting themselves. The article also notes that a prior attempt in the Seventh Circuit failed after the plaintiffs were ruled to have a lack of standing. Now, over the weekend, Trump was involved in 2 different media events that are probably now the top 2 political campaign events in any of our lifetimes. He went on Joe Rogan's podcast and then headlined a massive rally yesterday at New York's famed Madison Square Garden, 25,000 people inside, and an estimated 75,000 more people just hanging out outside the arena, having their own impromptu MAGA rally. We talk about things being narratively too big to rig. They are narratively too big to rig. Everyone who's paying attention is aware of these events. Anyone who follows Trump, anyone who has woken up at any point during the Trump era, anyone who is able to watch either of these 2 events rationally and forming their own opinions about what it is they saw will know that the media's portrayal of these events is entirely inaccurate. And while I'm sure there are people who will watch one or the other and still come away not liking Trump, I think it would be really hard for anyone to believe that everybody else hates Donald Trump, or that the Donald Trump portrayed by the media actually represents Donald Trump the man. These media events are basically litmus tests for the Trump deranged. Is it possible to actually pay attention to these events and still believe that the majority of the country hates Donald Trump right along with them? That's impossible. Every one of the anti-Trump narratives the media has thrown at Donald Trump over the last 9 years has now failed. All of them are broken. All of them are gone. No one who's actually paying attention and being honest actually believes Donald Trump is racist, or that Donald Trump is literally Hitler, or that Donald Trump is a rapist, or that he's corrupt, or that he's stupid. All of it has failed. There is now a negative social consequence attached to talking about Donald Trump in those terms. MAGA is now cool in the mainstream. Now, I don't want to spend a ton of time on either of these events because they're important in the narratively too big to rig sense, and I'm glad they happened, but we're not the primary target audience of those events. I do want to hit a couple moments. This is from the Rogan interview.
By the way, I called it. I said he just got himself indicted. This group is stupid, but they're vicious. They're stupid people, but they're vicious people.
The 2020 elections, you say you have all this evidence that it was rigged. Why haven't you put this evidence in a consumable form? In what?
Oh, I did. I have books on it. And by the way, books have been written on it. We have an author named Hemingway who is a great writer. She wrote a book on it, but many books have been written on it. There are books that are... What's happened is judges don't want to touch it. They would say you don't have standing. They didn't rule on the merits. They ruled the merits never got there. The judges didn't have what it took to turn over an election.
Let's talk about the potential vulnerabilities for elections and election fraud. One of them is mail-in ballots. The other one is if someone can break into voting machines. If someone can hack voting machines. Those are 2 huge ones.
So
and
Elon
can be
Musk,
done?
Elon Musk, I think he said it publicly. I hope he did because I wouldn't want to be the one. But he's a really smart guy. And he's a very good guy with computers, right? You'd say he's
one of the smartest people alive.
Anybody that can land that 20-story building and perfect and boom.
While he's doing Starlink, while he's
talking
Tesla,
to me
while
about
he owns Twitter.
And then he agrees to Starlink.
And he tweets 100 times a day.
He's an amazing guy. Right?
Yeah.
He said to me that unless you have paper ballots, it can never be an honest election. That's a big statement.
It's a big statement.
We should go to paper ballots. You know, France did. They went to mail-in voting, and it was all messed up.
What can be
the
done?
Amazing thing with the machines? So we have the machines. They cost 10 times more. Paper ballot would cost 8%. And they make paper ballots, they're all watermarked and everything else. They're very sophisticated. But if you take a look, paper ballots, 8% the cost, and you're done by 9 o'clock in the evening, right? Now we have these sophisticated machine. It goes up to heaven. It goes all over the place and down and around. and they say, we'll need 2 weeks to figure out who the hell won the election.
Do you think that's by design?
Yeah, I do. I think it's very crooked. That's my opinion.
You're allowed to have an opinion.
All right, so some of the commentary after the Rogan interview was released on Friday night and into Saturday throughout the day, particularly coming from standard issue villagers on the uniparty right, was that Donald Trump didn't make his case that elections in our country are stolen and that he has the quote unquote evidence to prove it. Now, to make that case, you would have to think that the evidence that proves it isn't already widely available. And of course it is, and it has been for 4 years. And of course, no one can prove at all that Joe Biden received 81 million real lawful American votes, and no one ever has, and they're not allowed to check, which should be enough just in itself. But for people who receive all their beliefs from authority, there was apparently some unfulfilled anticipation that Donald Trump would take them through chapter and verse of election fraud so that then they could critique all his claims, because of course that's what they always do. Donald Trump did not take the audience through chapter and verse of election fraud, but they had the conversation. It was brought up. Trump very clearly said relatively early on in the podcast that Joe Biden didn't win. And over the course of the 3-hour conversation, it came up a number of times, and there was absolutely no doubt about where Trump stood on the issue. Rogan played very neutral, which I suppose is a step up from where he's been the last 4 years. Trump made a fine case, but the truth is it's not his case to make. He's already made the case. He made the case as president right after the election. In the months before the election and after the election, he kept pointing out examples of election interference, election malfeasance, fraud, crime, corruption, etc. He said the election was under protest. As president, he said that. The information has been out there for anyone who wants to look, and at this point, it's not Trump's case to make. Why don't all of those very conservative Republican normies put the country before their benefactors and try to figure out for themselves whether or not our elections are legitimate? People who've spent the last 4 years ignoring our fake elections do not get to be critiquing the case Donald Trump made on Joe Rogan while they're just having a normal conversation. Trump made it clear that the machines are unreliable. Again, that's all you should need to know. There are 50 examples like that, but any one of them should be all anyone needs to know to withhold one's consent from being governed by any of these people. Trump talked about paper ballots. He also talked about watermarked paper ballots. 4 years ago, when Steve Pieczenik was talking about that, we were all told that was a conspiracy theory. Hey, maybe it was, but it probably isn't. And Trump's talking about it, and apparently Elon talks about it too. We covered an article a few months back from the Wall Street Journal called Inside Donald Trump and Elon Musk's Growing Alliance. And in that article, they mentioned Musk's meetings with a billionaire investor named Nelson Peltz. Here's what it said. Musk, along with the billionaire investor Nelson Peltz, has also briefed Trump on a plan they have developed to invest in a data-driven project to prevent voter fraud, according to some of the people. So Elon's definitely been paying attention to the problem and working on it on what seems to be a fairly high level. And during his speech at Madison Square Garden last night, Donald Trump said this about Elon Musk.
Because we can take the Senate pretty easily. And I think with our little secret, we're going to do really well with the House, right? Our little secret is having a big impact. He and I have a secret. We'll tell you what it is when the race is over.
Now, I'm not a huge fan of powerful people telling us that they've got a secret we can't know about, but I think I'll be able to control myself for the next 10 days and wonder what that secret might be. Is it that the election is fake? Is it that the fake election is going to be fake canceled? Is it some method of election integrity to guard the fake election? Is it about a potential reprisal if the regime does something dumb? Or could Trump and Elon be taunting the regime in a way that suggests something much bigger than what the TV reports as the outcome of a fake election? It's worth keeping in mind that Jeff Bezos may well be following the Elon Musk model. After a weekend of freakouts, most especially by former Washington Post editor and Victoria Nuland husband Robert Kagan, The latest is that Jeff Bezos wants to turn the Washington Post into a more conservative outlet. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Do we need the Washington Post to retain its prominent place in our culture by pretending to be our friend while we are still so desperate and groveling for allies that we're simply happy to forgive the Washington Post simply as an act of convenience? That would be ridiculous. We don't actually need a mainstream media. People are constantly concerned about the laws that govern mainstream media and who's allowed to say what. But the truth is we don't need a mainstream media and shouldn't have a mainstream media. We certainly don't need to allow media brands to rehabilitate their image simply by switching from one brand of the uniparty to the other. Now, I'm not saying nothing good comes from this. If the Washington Post goes anti-Trump, it may provide an off-ramp for some of the very few remaining redeemable communists out there. They may finally feel like they have someone who seems like a peer to them, who agrees that their more extreme friends are really extreme, way off the reservation. And maybe that'll allow them to get out, and hopefully that's the case. But I don't think that means we need to decide that Washington Post is good now and begin assuming that they're really reporting the real news. Now, speaking of reporting really real news just all the time, Tucker Carlson was one of the guests who was invited to speak at Madison Square Garden. And there was one part of his speech that I really liked a lot. Here it is.
And the second reason that people love Trump, and I put myself in this category, it's why I'm here today, is because he's liberated us in the deepest and truest sense. And the liberation he has brought to us is the liberation from the obligation to tell lies. Donald Trump has made it possible for the rest of us to tell the truth about the world around us. And that's the single most liberating thing you can do for people. If you want to enslave people, if you want to degrade them, force them to tell lies. And they have. They force us to lie about everything at gunpoint, effectively. They put people in prison for refusing to lie. And not just the obvious lies that men can become women or Vladimir Putin blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. No, honestly, he did. January 6th was an insurrection. They were unarmed, but it was very insurrection-y. Not even the obvious ones, but the big lie. You know what the big lie is? The big lie is that they're impressive. That's what the big lie is. That the people in charge have somehow earned the right to rule over you, and they haven't. And you know that. These are the single most useless people in the United States. They have no skills whatsoever. They've got 3/4 of the money, and they didn't earn it. They set up a system precisely for the purpose of awarding themselves wealth and power when it's undeserved. You look at Liz Cheney and you ask yourself honestly, what skill could she possibly have that allowed her to send hundreds of thousands of people to their deaths? Did she earn that? I don't think she did. No fair system would make Liz Cheney powerful. No fair system would make Larry Fink rich. No fair system would elevate someone like Kamala Harris to a presidential nomination. She's never been accused of doing anything useful. She has precisely no achievements. She's a nominee without getting a single vote. She is a metaphor for the system they created to make themselves rich and powerful, and then they have the gall to lecture you, the people who can actually change a flat tire and repair a power grid, who have useful jobs, who pay your taxes and work 40 hours a week, lecture you that you are somehow immoral. And Donald Trump has empowered the rest of us through mostly just sticking around in the face of their hate and abuse and persecution. He has given the rest of us the right to call BS on the charade. No, you are not better than us. No, you are not smarter than us. No, you do not deserve what you have. You probably stole it. No, you're not going to bully me into silence anymore. And I can promise you at this point, 9 days out, when Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Elon Musk and Tulsi Gabbard and pretty much every high school senior and college shorty girl in the country has come out finally saying, yeah, I am for Donald Trump, actually. When the entire country has realized there is nothing embarrassing about this. What's embarrassing is to take a perfectly great country and destroy it, as they have, I'm not ashamed. You should be. At that moment, it's going to be pretty tough for them 10 days from now to look in the eye to America with a straight face. It's going to be pretty hard to look at us and say, you know what? Kamala Harris, she got 85 million votes because she's just so impressive.
Now, as usual with Tucker, I'm not on board with all of that, but his point about Donald Trump liberating the people to tell the truth is absolutely dead on. Donald Trump has been the catalyst of the awakening. I can't imagine that anyone else could have done that. I actually posted on Saturday afternoon on Truth Social and on Telegram, Donald Trump is the extraordinarily unlikely solution to the problem of how to righteously preside over a totally brainwashed population with all the evil power in the world in opposition. I don't know that it could have possibly been done in any other way by any other person, but somehow or another, whether totally random circumstance or the result of a grand, magnificent plan of absolute control, it has happened. Donald Trump has liberated the people to tell the truth again. Now, that's not to say that everyone has accepted their liberation or that everyone wants to tell the truth. There are a lot of people out there who have no interest in telling the truth and prefer the rewards of the system. And I wish those people the best of luck, but for everyone else, we're going to keep moving forward. Now, the media last week made an attempt, all assets deployed, to say that Donald Trump was literally Hitler again for the 9th year running, based on claims that were published in a book 2 years ago about comments that were supposedly made like 7 years ago. And that failed. And then they tried a Donald Trump groped me while Jeffrey Epstein watched sexual assault story from 31 years ago. And both of those fell flat. No one cared because no one believes it. Then Kamala held a quote unquote rally in Houston the other night where the 30,000 people who attended thought they were getting a free Beyonce concert and instead were treated to Beyonce walking out on stage dressed like a futuristic witch in front of a sign that says vote for reproductive freedom, which is nothing more than a pro-abortion sign. Beyonce, a woman who has been credibly accused of witchcraft by a band member, came out not too long after a number of white-coated scientists and doctors, the priestly class of the false reality, went out on stage to talk about how important abortion is. After performing her weird seance, Beyonce simply left. There was no performance. And the fans began leaving the arena immediately and booing Kamala during her speech because the people in the building came for Beyonce, not Kamala. This is what they've been doing for years, since the Obama era. Hillary Clinton had one of these events. Saturday, November 5th, 2016. This is CNN, Jay-Z and Beyonce, headline concert for Clinton. Hey, Kamala, where is Jay-Z? Why are all of Diddy's friends coming out and endorsing Kamala so hard? Where is the star power? This was supposed to be Kamala Harris's big event. Make the entire campaign about abortion. Look, she got Beyonce. Beyonce did a concert. Nope, Beyonce didn't do a concert, and Kamala got booed in her big moment. Somehow over the weekend, Kamala figured out how to make it even worse. She went to a black church yesterday and did this.
Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning. The path may seem hard, the work may seem heavy, but joy cometh in the morning, and church morning is on its way.
Now, it's possible that what she meant was mourning with an OU, but regardless, I'm not sure whose voice she was using. I guess that Kamala just assumes that Black Americans want to be spoken to in a Martin Luther King voice when they are being told to obey and get back in line. So the weekend was a disaster for the anti-Trump contingent in terms of whether or not things would be narratively too big to rig. They decided to ignore the fact that their Trump is literally Hitler play from last week was a failure. They've been intending to run this very op for a very long time, to call Donald Trump Hitler, having a political rally in Madison Square Garden that supposedly evokes the memory of the actual Nazi rally held there in 1939. And it's funny, I guess the payoff is that they think people are going to associate Trump with Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, which they already won't do after 9 years of telling them they should. But it might make people look back and look into Nazis. And it's better when people just focus on how bad Nazis are and who the Nazis now are than actually learning about the Nazis then. To avoid that, the regime focused on simply calling Donald Trump a Nazi. Here are some headlines, a collage put together once again by my pal, Patriots in Control. Sky News: was Donald Trump's Madison Square Garden rally an evocation of Nazism? The Guardian: Trump fills Madison Square Garden with anger, vitriol, and racist threats. Daily Beast: Donald Trump's racist NYC rally was vile. It was also political suicide. Trump headlines Madison Square Garden rally after vulgar, racist remarks from allies, says Reuters. So now he's responsible for what other people say. HuffPost: damning new montage show how Trump's rhetoric has taken a Nazi turn. Oh, they creatively edited something to make it sound like Donald Trump was Adolf Hitler? Wow, very impressive, HuffPo. Everybody better watch that. The New York Times: Trump at the Garden, a closing carnival of grievances, misogyny, and racism. Another night at the Garden: how Trump's rally echoed one in 1939. That too was from the Times. CNN: Trump unveils the most extreme closing argument in modern presidential history. The Associated Press: Trump's Madison Square Garden events feature crude and racist insults. And it just keeps going and going. MSNBC, Times, CBS, USA Today. One more, full on, all hands on deck, Trump is literally Hitler media movement. What the media did was launch a Trump is literally Hitler narrative, an old, recycled rerun of a narrative to preempt the impact of his appearance at Madison Square Garden so they could run the whole narrative about how the Nazis played Madison Square Garden too. But of course, that's not the entire arc. This morning on NBC News, extremists inspired by conspiracy theories pose major threat to 2024 elections, U.S. intelligence warns. And this is from NBC News' Brandy Zadrozny, who spends all her time on MSNBC when she's not debunking conspiracy theories and pointing out who's anti-vax and QAnon. She is one of the false reality's top normies. U.S. intelligence agencies have identified domestic extremists with grievances rooted in election-related conspiracy theories, including beliefs in widespread voter fraud and animosity toward perceived political opponents, as the most likely threat of violence in the coming election. Now, as one of those conspiracy theorists, I will tell you, I've seen absolutely nothing about violence after this election. We don't need violence. The entire point of this period was to avoid violence and to avoid a civil war. The regime's number one goal is a civil war. That's part of the playbook. They try to cause a civil war on the way out, so they never get all the way out. And then because they're behind the civil war, they're on the winning side of the civil war. And once they've won the civil war, then they bring themselves right back to power. Sometimes they even increase their power, as they did after our first civil war. Violence and civil war are regime goals. They are regime wins. We don't want that. All we asked for was legitimate elections, and they spat in our faces. Let's continue. In a joint intelligence bulletin that was not distributed publicly, but was reviewed by NBC News, agents from the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security warned state and local law enforcement agencies that domestic violent extremists seeking to terrorize and disrupt the vote are a threat to the election and throughout Inauguration Day. The report identified the potential targets as candidates, elected officials, election workers, members of the media, and judges involved in election cases. The potential threats include physical attacks and violence at polling places, ballot drop boxes, voter registration locations, and rallies and campaign events. Now, if I didn't know better, I would say that the FBI, DHS, and Brandy Zadrozny are cooking up conspiracy theories. They're making baseless claims, but because those claims are derived from the authoritative source, they become true automatically, and then we have to refute them. We are supposed to believe that there are roving bands of Trump supporters out there plotting violence against local election officials. It is preposterous. Now, perhaps this will be a justification for them putting the fencing and the troops back around the Capitol from maybe November 5th all the way through January 20th, or who knows how long. But otherwise, and considering the source, this seems designed to play right into the narrative last week of Donald Trump as literally Hitler, the rally being a Nazi rally, and all of Donald Trump's supporters, the election deniers and conspiracy theorists, the Nazi foot soldiers who are about to go commit violent acts against their political opposition. Next, we'll be told that they chose for themselves the enemies within and took direct action against them. We are going to see entire narrative lines pushing toward a civil war, and we should be prepared for that. There will be all types of provocations. Back to the article. The October internal report was among several intelligence documents obtained through public records requests by Property of the People, a nonprofit focused on government transparency. And then they handed them over to Brandy Zadrozny of NBC. Got it. Federal agents regularly provide that type of threat assessment to state and local law enforcement agencies through formal bulletins. But I guess they just didn't this time. It's a very real threat, though. Very real. Before January 6th, 2021, they were more reluctant to distribute them because of concern that investigations of Americans might appear to violate free speech protections. And everybody knows they're not really concerned about that. The United States remains in a heightened dynamic threat environment, and we continue to share information with our law enforcement partners about the threats posed by domestic violent extremists in the context of the 2024 election, DHS spokesperson Mayra Rodriguez said in a statement. Violence has no place in our politics, and DHS continues to work with our partners to evaluate and mitigate emerging threats that may arise from domestic or foreign actors. And you have to wonder if their partners are all themselves foreign actors, because it's become a bit unclear which homeland the Department of Homeland Security believes it should be protecting. Still, the reports are not typical election threat intelligence, said Ryan Shapiro, Executive Director of Property of the People. The documents are unmistakably a product of a radically heightened threat environment. Well, are we sure about that? Why should we believe them about that? Because the documents weren't released publicly, they had to be retrieved through a FOIA? And this guy who does this work knew the documents existed and asked for the right thing in the FOIA and just so happened to get this unreleased document from the FBI and DHS and hand it over to the conspiracy theory lady at MSNBC? Oh, yeah, sounds totally natural. That is definitely what happened. Former President Donald Trump has claimed elections have been rigged against him since 2016 when he won the Electoral College but lost the popular vote. In 2020, he and his allies ramped up false claims of cheating, lies the courts quickly struck down. And again, of course, she leaves out the fact that it was on procedural grounds. But the claims became fuel for a violent attack at the Capitol, which aimed to overturn the election. Legitimately, all of this is a conspiracy theory fever dream that standard issue villagers trapped in the false reality think is a collection of absolutely indisputable facts and a conclusion that would make sense if any of those facts were true. They just happen not to be. Perceptions of election fraud are a quote-unquote prominent narrative for extremists who have targeted government officials and election officials. with at least 3 domestic extremist attacks and 2 disrupted plots being linked to such false claims since January 6th, according to the report. Really? What incidents is she referring to? Intelligence agents also listed immigration, LGBTQ issues, abortion, and the failed assassination attempts against Trump as motivations for recent calls for violence from extremists. It sounds like they are just reporting on the comments they post on anonymous message boards, and they've got to hit all the various identity groups. This is ridiculous. Threats to election workers, including letters containing white powder, online harassment, and threats and swatting, in which fake calls to emergency services trigger potentially dangerous law enforcement responses to people's homes, have recently increased, according to the FBI. Such threats tend to originate from areas where election results have been contested, according to the report. Election officials have responded to the warnings by ramping up security measures. In Maricopa County, Arizona, an epicenter of election conspiracy theories and challenges in 2020, officials are reportedly implementing heightened security measures for Election Day, including metal detectors, armed guards, drones, and police snipers. Wait a second. So the military basically is going to be guarding our elections? Oh, no, wait. This level of security is totally justifiable based on these threats. But if Donald Trump addressed these threats with the National Guard or the military and called these domestic extremists the enemy within, well, then he would be literally Hitler again. The reports follow others released in recent weeks that warn of an increase in online chatter about an impending civil war, as well as several incidents of violence or thwarted attacks before the election. Agents wrote that some extremists were, quote, reacting to the 2024 election season and prominent policy issues by engaging in illegal, preparatory, or violent activity that they link to the narrative of an impending civil war. Really? Where is it? How come none of us who spend an inordinate amount of time paying attention to what Trump supporters actually believe have ever heard anything about any of this? Anytime people talking about these subjects enter most chats, people immediately point out that they sound like feds and point out that they are glowing. That's how much they stick out. That's how obvious it is that they're infiltrators trying to entrap people. The movement she's suggesting does not exist, but its false reality opposite does. In fact, it's BLM Antifa. They were everywhere during the summer of love and the lead up to the 2020 election. We are not the side that plans street violence. We are not the people who join groups run by undercover FBI agents. Let's finish this out. A separate October bulletin from Colorado's State Threat Assessment Center highlighted threats posed by people who dispute the legitimacy of the 2020 election results. The report underscored the problem of insider threats in which people with authorized access to the election process might attempt to derail it. It also noted a, quote, continued dialogue amongst individuals on extremist discussion groups and forums that the results of the 2020 elections were inaccurate. So they are attempting to define discussion about the 2020 election and the 2024 election as extremist content, which means they could get it censored, or at least they could argue for its censorship and get some portion of the American people to go along with them. Colorado is obviously one of the most captured states in the country, so it's no surprise their illegitimate officials would be propagating the notion that election deniers are posing an extremist threat of violence. Man, they really, really don't want people asking about the integrity of our fake elections. The report noted recent incidents of targeted violence, including increased activity from white nationalists and Proud Boy organizing against Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio. The Proud Boys are back, and the white nationalists. They're going to go after the Haitians who are eating the dogs and eating the cats and eating the pets of the people who live there. It noted disturbing calls for violence on anonymous online message boards targeting election workers and undocumented immigrants as part of, quote, election steal defense prep, end quote. So there it is. Anonymous claims on anonymous message boards that fall under some standard of disturbing calls for violence, according to Brandy Zadrozny and whatever people at the FBI and DHS wanted the media to print this information so bad that they indirectly linked it through a friendly FOIA request. That is quite the effort, commies. Great job. Now, my friend G Money posted this clip of Jason Lowery discussing his soft war theory as I was recording the episode. And so we'll bring it all the way back around to the beginning and wrap things up with this. Space Force Major Jason Lowery discussing his MIT thesis, soft war.
You get back to this conversation that we had before, which is if they've got nukes and you don't, then the only response, the only rational response, like you have no choice. You must master this technology. You have to adopt it as quickly as possible. If the world is adopting a physical power projection technology for cyberspace, a new base layer physically secure internet, and the only way to attack people through it is by collateralizing their bits, i.e. by using Bitcoin, then you must adopt this technology. This is not a conversation. This is not a negotiation. It is adapt or die, cooperate or die. The Department of Treasury is not qualified to be talking about this. The Federal Reserve Bank is not qualified to be talking about this. If we just throw away this coin part, all these other people masquerading as experts in proof of work technology look ridiculous. And at the same time, you prove that the ESG narrative about this being inefficient is also equally ridiculous. So maneuver warfare, take the fight you can win. If you want to defeat the Department of Treasury, all these ESG fudsters, all these shitcoiners, and the Federal Reserve, take them on head on, and while simultaneously say that we have no choice but to adopt this. I don't care what you have to say. We have to adopt it. Then frame it as I just framed it.
I guess we'll have to see if he's right. Seems important, though. Might want to check it out. I don't know if it's right, but I know it's an important decision and one that I believe demands your attention. I'll be back tomorrow at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic, and Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening for free and would like to support the show, the best way to do that is by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can find the info stream over on Telegram at t.me/veryreasonable. The merch site is cancelcouture.com, and for all my other links, you can visit linktree.com/imyourmoderator. And I'll see you soon. Down on the range.